The first new nuclear reactor in 7 years began operations in Georgia back in July. And while a new survey from Pew Research Center found that Americans still favor solar power and wind power over nuclear, building power plants to produce nuclear energy is steadily gaining in popularity. In fact, 57% of Americans are now in favor of more nuclear power plants compared to 43% back in 2020, with support increasing among both major political parties. Now, Lightbridge Corporation focuses on building new state-of-the-art fuel technology to make nuclear power plants safer, more efficient, and more economic. And with focus shifting to using more sustainable energy practices, the company is seeing more interest. With that in mind, let's bring in Lightbridge Corporation CEO Seth Grae to discuss this more. Good to have you on the show here, Seth. So talk about how this development is different from the traditional sort of nuclear fuel technology that people have been familiar with.
Right. The fuels used in reactors are based on these pellets of uranium, a couple of hundred of them stacked inside a metal tube. And it's been that way for about 60 years with slight tweaks to the technology. So Lightbridge has reimagined how to design nuclear fuel from scratch using modern technology, modern metallurgy, using a very different approach so that we could redesign fuel that makes it run 1,000 degrees Celsius, about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, cooler in the reactor than the current fuels do in the exact same reactor, while producing even more power, making the reactor even safer, even more non-proliferative, better able to go up and down in power to work with renewables on a zero carbon grid. And we're partnering with Idaho National Laboratory, which is owned by the U.S. Department of Energy, to test the fuel and roll it out commercially. And we're making tremendous progress. And, as your polling shows, there's tremendous support for new nuclear power. And that's partly for climate reasons. It's partly for energy security reasons. So we and allies don't rely on Putin for fossil fuels.
And I do want to ask you, because as much support as people may have for the fuel itself, for the nuclear fuel technology, in terms of where it actually gets built, it's one of those things that people like the idea of it, as long as it's not in their backyard being built somewhere. How do you get over those concerns that people have about where some of this infrastructure will end up going?
Yeah, well, first of all, some of the new smaller reactors will be what's called behind the meter, where they'll be at industrial facilities like oil refineries, data centers, or government facilities like military bases, and take them off grid so that even if someone attacks the electric grid, brings down the electric grid, we don't lose those emergency facilities. Nuclear has what's called an energy density of about 1,000,000 to 1 advantage over anything else, of just how much energy you make from the amount of material. So you don't need a lot of reactors. A lot of people see a lot of wind and solar and hardly ever see a nuclear reactor and think that there's more power from wind and solar than there is from nuclear. But there's not, because each reactor makes so much power. So you could put these plants not near where people live, but outside the cities. And the newer, smaller plants are being designed to be so safe that we expect the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will license some of them to operate without needing an emergency planning zone, even across the street from the site, that everything will be contained within, even in the very unlikely event that something goes wrong, it could never hurt anybody.
And we have to talk about the size of this industry. I mean, by some estimations, a $25 billion global market for this sort of fuel here. Who are the front runners here?
Well, for Lightbridge, one of the great advantages we have is that there are hundreds of existing reactors in the world that could switch to using our fuel. So we'll be targeting them first. Those are the front runners. And then we expect the more large reactors that are being built, like the one that you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, can use the fuel. But then as we switch to these smaller reactors, there are many of those that could use our fuel too and bring real advancements, real improved economics and safety. And we think those smaller reactors, faster to build, many of them can be built largely in factories and shipped to sites, like building a 737 aircraft in factory by the thousands ultimately. So we see first the existing reactors, then moving on toward these smaller reactors that will ultimately be largely factory built.
And it's interesting because some of the ways that nuclear fuel technology is presented is almost as if it's a transitory solution while sort of the infrastructure and the other things needed for, say, wind and solar and water really get up to pace to meet the demand here. Is that how we should be viewing it? Or is nuclear fuel technology supposed to be that end all that's actually going to make some of the others more irrelevant?
Well, I think we'll always need a diversified energy mix with different sources that we use for our energy. And there are benefits of doing that. And there's certainly some places where renewables make sense, where hydro makes sense. But nuclear is going to be necessary. We're going to need to have massive growth in nuclear power within a diversified energy mix because nuclear is what's called baseload power. It's there at full power 24/7, 365. If the wind isn't blowing, if the sun isn't shining, if there's been droughts and the hydroelectric dam isn't operating at full power, like we're seeing now with the Hoover Dam, for example, nuclear is there. Even in severe storms in Texas, nuclear got the state through that. So nuclear is just going to be part of the mix in a growing way if we're going to meet climate and energy security goals. And the new technologies like what Lightbridge is developing are really going to help nuclear meet those goals.
And I mean, we are still continuing to push towards a cleaner future. I mean, when you look at the growth of the EV space as well, but then you also have, when it comes to nuclear, people wondering about sort of the energy intensive process when it comes to perhaps mining, milling and enriching the uranium in the first place in order to get this clean energy. So when people are trying to balance out, clean versus green and making it sort of worth the inputs that perhaps might damage the climate in the process, how do you square that?
Oh, nuclear is more than a 98% reduction in CO2 emissions versus, say, coal life cycle from mining uranium through handling the used fuel that comes out of the reactors. Again, with this more than 1,000,000 to 1 amount of energy that you get per unit of fuel material that you need. So yes, you mine uranium, but you mine very little. I mean, something the size of a soda can is the amount of nuclear fuel material you need to provide all of the energy used in a lifetime of somebody in the United States. That's it. That tiny amount of mined material versus massive amounts of fossil fuel. There's just no comparison. And same for the concrete pours for building the facilities, the steel. It's so little compared to the massive energy that plant will produce. So nuclear is probably overall just the most reliable, best way to decarbonize. And when you use batteries, when you use renewables, you have a lot of mined rare earths and other materials from China, from other countries that aren't very friendly to us. So it's not just CO2 from mining, but it's also really pushing us into reliance on countries for our energy that maybe we don't want to rely on.
And that's an incredible visual there, the size of a soda can for the lifetime of power that someone in the US would need. Fascinating stuff there. Appreciate you joining me this morning. Lightbridge Corporation CEO, Seth Grae, thank you for your time.
Thank you.